Welcome to this week's edition of Word of Truth Podcast.
It's not recording.
Oh,
Now go.
welcome to this week's edition of Word of Truth Podcast. This is Jordan.
And this is Jaron. And this week we're going to begin a study talking about names. So this week we're going to begin with what is a name, or what's in a name. As we all know, when you think of certain names, it kind of brings about certain connotations or ideas when you're talking about people. Today, if we were to bring up the name, for instance, Karen, everyone has a very strong image of what that is. You bring up the name like Kyle, someone will have a different image. You bring up the name Steve, is a different image. Go ahead.
You bring up the name Jaron, it comes to mind easily forgotten,
Rude,
at least in
but
our family.
probably true. No. So, but so as you hear names, they all kind of carry almost a stereotype with them. You think of a Karen, you think of like a suburban mom with a short bob cut who always complains to a manager. You think of a Kyle, you think of like kind of the skater guy always drinking Monster from high school. It's kind of annoying. Think of Steve, you think of your typical suburban, like your typical suburban white dad, super like kind of corny or whatever. And so names carry kind of a meaning with them. They create images in our head when we think about different names. We find that this is all, they're very much the same when we're dealing with Bible characters. You bring up, say, Jezebel, that that name brings up an image with it. Or, you bring up the name David, or you bring up the name Joshua, or you bring up the name Jesus. All of these names we either use or don't use based on the connotation that they carry with them. They have a very powerful thing with, by having a certain name can have a very powerful meaning later on. And we find this also in Proverbs chapter 22, 1 and 2. It says, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. And again, in Ecclesiastes 7 and 1, a good name is better than precious ointments, and the day of death better than the day of birth. There's a lot of importance in this name. And I know that's kind of a little out of context because it's talking like your physical name and then your reputation. But they kind of go hand in hand with each other. And so
Yeah,
with
so
that,
one example, as we talk about this and what we want to keep in the back of our minds, there's a lot of people have, especially in the Bible, their names meant something. And we may have brought this up in a previous podcast, that names are chosen differently than they are today, right? When Brandy and I, oh, sorry, chose the name for Layla, it wasn't so much delving into the meaning of the name and everything for the reason that we chose it. It was what did we like the way that it sounded. But anyways, when you think of like David's name meant beloved. But for us, because of the life that he lived, we so often associate it with a description that is given of him where it says that he was a man after God's own heart. So when we look at like our names, we kind of build the definition of who we are and what our name will mean for those who knew us. So we're going to get into a study here of a man named Abner. And Abner, if you want to read about him, he is found in most of the verses, I think almost all of them, are found in 1st and 2nd Samuel that deal with, little snippets of Abner and the life that he lived.
Yeah. And so you read through, I believe it's 2 Samuel 2 through 4 is where I found a lot of mine. We find that he was a commander of Saul's army. So he was a commander under King Saul. And when it came time that Saul passed away, he actually played a very negative impact or negative role with the kingdom. He kind of usurped David's authority to begin with, and we find that he took Saul's son and placed him as king over Israel, while David was king over Judah, which stayed loyal to him down in Hebron. And so we find that like he played kind of a big role in dividing the kingdom, which wasn't really, the greatest way to wear the name Abner to begin with. But we find that, as the story kind of goes on, that connotation changes with some of the actions that he has towards the end of his life.
So, when we think about Abner, one of our friends, they named their son Abner, and out of curiosity, because it's not a common name today, when we found out that's what they were naming their son, I looked it up, and the name Abner means son of Ner. So, there,
It's
there's
very
not a whole
befitting.
lot there to describe who Abner would be other than who his father was in the Bible. So when we look at the life of Abner, you kind of see him building his reputation. And one of the things that I kind of noticed as I read is that he was very loyal to Saul. One, he was the cousin of Saul. He was the commander in the army, right? He served his king, and after Saul uh, is killed, after he's shot, then commits suicide, and then the Philistines behead him, we see that Abner, is not ready yet to move on. And so he's still doing what he thought was best and staying loyal to his king by then taking the remaining uh, family member and putting him in power as Saul's sons had been killed. Um, and so, when you think about that, yes, he was working against the kingdom, but you see how loyal he was to Saul and to his kingdom.
And you find that this loyalty goes to almost a fault. Like he's loyal to a fault, basically. He stays loyal longer than he probably should have to the kingdom of Saul. And this kind of leads up to the breaking point, I believe, in chapter 3 of Second Samuel, I want to say, where
Hmm.
he finally becomes at odds with Saul's son Eshbaal, um, and realizes, I was loyal to the wrong person. If God has given the kingdom to David, then, I should be helping make that happen rather than staying loyal to Saul's house. And we find that he then makes that, he makes that connection, he makes that switch, and he goes to make an agreement then with David to help reunite the kingdom under David.
Yeah, and so you see um, kind of the humility that he had, I guess you could say. One, I mean, he was obviously offended, and we don't know why there was this accusation made against him uh, by Ishbosheth, the one who or Saul's son, who was placed in power. We don't know why, there was this falling out and this accusation made against Abner, but Abner took his loyalty very seriously, and to be counted as not being loyal, he felt disrespected. And so then you see him going, making a treaty with David, and then him fulfilling that work. So he was loyal over here to Saul's family, but then as he is disrespected and he makes the treaty with David, you see him working to reunite the Israelite kingdom once again with all the tribes underneath the rule of David as he calls them out in 2 Samuel chapter 3, as he's saying, look, you need to go um, and start, serving under David, right? It's time. The Lord said this was going to happen. This was what we've been waiting for. It's time to now be united together.
Yeah. And then we find, though, as he's doing this good work, he reaches an untimely death. Because he goes, and earlier on in chapter, I think beginning of chapter 3, there's an incident that happens between him and Joab where he kills one of Joab's men, I believe his brother.
Hmm. Yeah, one of his
Yeah,
brothers.
one of his brothers, because they had a confrontation, and Abner was being chased by one of Joab's brothers, told him to stop multiple times, and then to try and knock the wind out of him, he hits him with the back of a spear, and the spear ends up going through the guy and kills him. And so as he goes and makes this treaty, Joab finds out that Abner's coming over to the side and is upset with David, who allowed him to come and go in peace because of what Abner was trying to do. And then Joab then murders Abner, uh, out of trying to uh, make up, I guess, for the murder of his brother. But we do find the reaction to this kind of insightful to the man that Abner was. When we find in 2 Samuel 3 and verse 38, King David talking of Abner, do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I'm anointed king, I am weak, and those the sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds. And that's pretty high praise for a man that, well, for a man from a king, from David, I don't know. But yeah.
Well, and you think about who Abner was for the longest time, as there's a civil unrest within the tribes of Israel as they were divided. I mean, Abner is the one who made sure that Saul's son would be in charge, right? That Ishbosheth would be in charge over the majority of the tribes. And then he's leading the attack against David and his army, as he would be the commander of the opposing army. Um, and you see at the very end, as he dies, that David says this about him. Right? His enemy says this about him because they had come together, they had this treaty. And David recognized that there was something special within Abner, and that's why he mourns that loss. And I imagine down the line we'll kind of talk about David, maybe have a lesson on him, because David has a history of this, with each of his oppressors and his enemies. If they, as long as they weren't, an enemy of the Lord, but those who were within the kingdom of Israel, David still respected them for who they were. I mean, when you go all the way back to David, when he defeats um, Goliath, Abner is the one who presents him before Saul. So he has known Abner for a long time, and he would have risen through the ranks under Abner's command within the army. So he would have recognized as he gets to this point that there is something there about Abner that is commendable. Um, and to finally be, on the same side, just to have Abner be tragically killed here, would have been disappointing.
Yeah. And so, with kind of looking at the story of Abner, what we can kind of pull is what we began talking about is like the power within a name. But as you're kind of hinting at, the power of us to define what that name means. Because his name to begin with, son of Ner, doesn't really say much about it. But then when you think to the person who wore that name and what that sets for those then to be named after him, it kind of sets the page, or sets the tone, I mean, for what that name means. When you think of Abner, you think of this man who was loyal. You think of this man who was called a great man upon his death by David. You think of the commendable things that he had done. And so he kind of sets the tone for what this name means.
And this kind of takes us back to one of the first verses that you brought up as we started this, that death is greater than one's birth. Because this man, Abner, was born and given the name to mean the son of Ner. But as he dies, he is called a prince and a great man, and a great commander. And so you see, he, through his life, worked to build a better meaning to his name. And so, as we go through this study over the next couple of weeks, and especially with this, we want to focus and see, what did these men and women do right, or where did they fall short, and then look at ourselves and say, what am I building my name to be? So when people, once I pass and people hear my name, what comes to their mind? What picture do I paint in other people's minds? Now, you can't control everyone's opinion, but your character is going to speak volumes to others.
Yeah.
And you can kind of direct that narrative as Abner did with his.
Well, and as we'll see, it's like one person in history who's done this great thing wearing that name can change what the image of that name is generationally, like with a David or with a Jezebel, for better or worse. So are we willing to step up and be the person to make that name mean something, as Abner did here and as the other people we'll get to have done in their lives as well? So, unless you have anything else,
No, that's about it.
with that being said, we'd like to thank you for listening in to this week's edition of a Word of Truth podcast. We hope that you stick with us. I'm actually pretty excited to see some of the other people and the names that we get to dive into throughout the study, and hopefully you all will be as well. And we'd like to give you a friendly reminder that he who has ears to hear, listen up.
Listen up. Well, real quick, um, for those who listen, well, I guess that's really our only audience, um, or watch on YouTube. If there's somebody, a name that you want us from the Bible to do a study on and to discuss, maybe you think that it would be beneficial for others to hear, or it's just something you're interested in and you kind of want to hear our take on it, we would encourage you to comment or send us a message on Facebook or uh, through
Instagram.
Instagram. I'll catch up one of these days, all the social media platforms, but message us and let us know, right? Reach out to us, and we have no problem with doing a study, and we'd appreciate it more to have that type of interaction.
Yeah. And with that being said, thank you again for listening and have a great weekend. You got to close this out, though.
Oh man.